Secrets of Strixhaven is finally here, and we have Elder Dragons, ridiculous spell synergies, Power 9 showing up on creatures, and all kinds of ridiculous stuff, which means we had better break it down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for our first daily dose of Secrets of Strixhaven spoilers. So Secrets of Strixhaven spoilers kicked off today, and we got a ton of cards to talk about, and I don't want to spoil too much, but I gotta say, this set looks amazing. Our first trip to Strixhaven, I thought it was kind of mid for a Magic plane, and this looks way better. There are so many cool cards, so many nostalgic cards, so many spicy things and combos and just mind-blowing new pieces of cardboard that we better jump right into it. Start talking new Magic cards. But before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Secrets of Strixhaven. First up today, we get a new blue mythic, but it's one that you might have seen before because it actually leaked a couple of days ago. But now we know how the prepared mechanic works, and this card is wild, and I love it. It's nostalgic, it's powerful. Emeritus of Ideation. So this is a 5-mana 5/5 flying ward 2 human wizard. It said this creature enters prepared, then when it attacks, you can exile 8 cards from your graveyard. If you do, it becomes prepared, and then there's another side to the card, which is literal Ancestral Recall. 1 blue mana instant, target player draws 3 cards. Like Power 9, one of the best cards ever made, Ancestral Recall. Also, this is a headliner. There's a serialized version, which you can see on the right, which looks like the old player reward Tidings to me. But anyway, how does this card work? So here's how prepared works. So if you have a creature that's prepared, and it is prepared, and thankfully Emeritus of Ideation enters prepared, so you can automatically have it prepared right away. Not all prepared cards do that, but this one enters prepared. So as long as Emeritus is prepared, you can, at any time it would be legal to cast the actual spell, pay 1 blue mana and cast a copy of Ancestral Recall. Target player draws 3 cards, but then Emeritus of Ideation will become unprepared. So if you want to cast Ancestral again, then you need to attack and exile 8 cards to prepare it again, or you could blink it. There's a couple of cards in the set that let you just prepare something, but that's how this works. So this is essentially a 5-mana 5/5 flying ward 2 human wizard, or it could be a 6-mana 5/5 flying ward 2 human wizard. The sort of ETBs draw 3 cards, but it's not even ETBs because you are literally casting the spell. So this is a Sphinx of the Clear Skies as far as the body, which obviously is not enough to make a card playable. We've had 5-mana 5/5 flying ward 2 creatures in the recent past. That's not enough to make a card good, but it's also an Ancestral Recall. As long as it's on the battlefield, you're literally Ancestral Recall, which kind of reminds me of upgraded for 2026 Arcanus the Omnipotent, is another 6-mana blue creature that can draw 3 cards, and you can potentially do it a second time if you jump through some hoops and do some things. So Emeritus of Ideation, worth pointing out that you literally cast the spell. I know there was some confusion about this, where people were like, well, is the Ancestral Recall mode, is that like an activated ability of a creature? No, you are actually casting a copy of Ancestral Recall, which means when you use that ability, it'll trigger your prowess on your Storm Chaser's Talent token, or make a token with Young Pyromancer. So any of the spell synergies you were hoping for, they will work with Emeritus of Ideation. Probably the craziest thing you can do with these prepared cards, and with Emeritus of Ideation in specific, is just blink it. That's the easiest way to reset its prepared ability. So you can play Emeritus, pay 1 Ancestral Recall, draw 3, and then like Cloud Shift, blink Emeritus, it enters prepared, so it'll be prepared again, pay 1 mana, draw 3. It gets super wild with Displacer Kitten. Displacer Kitten, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you get to blink a non-land permanent. So if you have Emeritus of Ideation, and it's prepared, you can pay 1 blue to cast a copy of Ancestral Recall. You're casting a non-creature spell, so that'll trigger the Displacer Kitten that can blink the Emeritus of Ideation, and then it'll be prepared again, so for 1 more blue mana, you can draw 3 more cards, and then blink it with Displacer's Kitten, and do it again. So it's not infinite, but you can draw a ridiculous amount of cards with this setup. So I think that's one of the easiest ways to take advantage of this card. As far as standard is concerned, I'm actually not sure how good this card is. My guess is it's very good, but is it as good as Quantum Riddler? That's where I'm not exactly sure. So we know that just being a Sphinx of the Clear Skies is not good enough to see Standard play in 2026, but we also know that being a Quantum Riddler is more than enough to see not just Standard play, but Modern play in 2026. I think Emeritus is close to Quantum Riddler, but for different decks. I think Quantum Riddler works really well in like the Badger Mole Cub style decks. I think Emeritus might be even better in like a Spellslinger style deck. With some of the synergies we were talking about, we're able to take advantage of the fact that you're actually casting an Ancestral Recall to trigger a bunch of stuff. Also seems good with like Blink decks, maybe a hardcore control deck could take advantage of it. So my guess is that Emeritus of Ideation, I think it's not going to beat out Quantum Riddler in the decks where Quantum Riddler is really, really good, like the Badger Mole Cub decks, but I do think it can be better than Quantum Riddler in some other standard shells. So Emeritus of Ideation, I absolutely love this card. I love the mechanic. It's so flavorful. It's super unique. We get an actual Ancestral Recall on a card, which is insane in 2026. Super nostalgic callback to some old cards. So I just absolutely love the design, and I think the card is very, very strong. We also got a while ago, one of our early spoilers from the set was Lorehold the Historian, an Elder Dragon. Well, today we found out there's a whole cycle of these, and all of these cards are wild. So the theme of this cycle of Elder Dragons, which call back to the origins of Commander really, is they're creatures that give your spells a very powerful old effect. So like Lorehold the Historian gives your instants and sorceries Miracle 2. We got Witherbloom the Balancer. It gives your instants and sorceries affinity for creatures. Prismari the Inspiration gives your instants and sorceries Storm. Quandrix the Prof gives your instants and sorceries Cascade, and then Silverquill the Deputant gives your instants and sorceries Casual 1, so you can sack a creature with at least 1 power and copy that spell. And I think these cards, I don't know how good they're going to be in Standard. I think some will be better than other in Standard. I think these look like to me, though, chase commanders. Like, I think these are going to be some of the most popular commanders that Wizards has made in a long, long time. People love dragons. They have big, flashy abilities. These are what Mythic should be. These are what legendary creatures should be. These are like the perfect design of both of those things. So let's talk about these cards one by one. Also, yeah, they all have a special treatment that looks pretty sweet. But we start with Witherbloom the Balancer. So Witherbloom, it is an 8-mana Golgari 5/5 Elder Dragon. It has affinity for creatures, so it's really not going to be 8 mana. It might be as cheap as 2 mana. It has Flying and Death Touch, and it says instants and sorcery spells you cast have affinity for creatures. So Witherbloom has a pretty unique mechanic with affinity for creatures. We've only seen a handful of creatures in Magic's history that have had this, and what this means in practice is even though Witherbloom has a really, really high mana cost, if you're playing a bunch of cheap creatures, you're going to be able to get it on the battlefield very, very quickly, and having a bunch of cheap creatures is exactly what Witherbloom wants, because not only does it have affinity for creatures, all your instants and sorceries will have it too once it's on the battlefield. So what do we do with Witherbloom the Balancer? So obviously the dream is you play a bunch of creatures, you get the Witherbloom on the battlefield, and then you start casting like Dream Harvest for 2 mana, Preposterous Proportions for 2 mana, just these massive spells that can take over the game really, really quickly on their own. It works maybe even better with X-Spells. My dream for this card, here's what I want to do with Witherbloom. I want to play some Badger Mole Cubs and Mana Dorks and stuff, make a bunch of mana, play the Witherbloom, then I want to Doppelgang to make a whole bunch of creatures. I can cast a very big Doppelgang because each creature is going to reduce the cost of my Doppelgang, and then the second Doppelgang, I'm going to have so many creatures on the battlefield, I can just cast the biggest Doppelgang that has ever happened, or I can Genesis Wave to put my entire deck into play, or I can Outrageous Robbery to steal your entire deck. So Witherbloom, very, very good with any sort of X spells. Also, insane with X spells that make creatures, like United Front or Song of Tatanzan. These cards do double duty because they take advantage of the fact that Witherbloom's going to make them way cheaper than they should be, and then they also add a bunch of creatures to the battlefield, which will make your next big spell way cheaper than it should be. So I think that's the direction that you go with this card. In older formats, there's also just a pretty easy 2-card infinite combo with Sprout Swarm and Witherbloom the Balancer. Lab Rat's also very good here, but Sprout Swarm, a 2-mana instant with Convoke and Buyback 3 that makes a 1/1 Sapperling token. So if you get enough creatures to reduce the cost of Sprout Swarm with Buyback to 1, you cast it for 1 mana thanks to affinity for creatures, it makes a Sapperling, then you can tap that Sapperling to pay the 1 the next time thanks to Convoke to make another one. So essentially just 2-card infinite 1/1 creature combo. As far as Standard's concerned, My dream for this card is to badger Molcub into a huge doppelgang and just do the most ridiculous thing you've ever seen. Like, it can get so crazy because the first doppelgang is going to give you even more creatures, then the next doppelgang is going to be even bigger, and then Arena explodes. The big challenge I see with this card, though, is really it pushes you in two directions. So you need a bunch of creatures to get Witherbloom on the battlefield and for its affinity ability, but then you also need a bunch of spells so you'll be able to cast something with the affinity for creatures mechanic. So it's going to be interesting to see exactly how this shakes out. In 60 card formats, it seems a little tricky, although in Commander, I think how you build around Witherbloom is basically just Overlord on mana dorks like Llanowar Elves and Birds of Paradise, so you flood the board with these cheap mana creatures, and then you just play these massive X spells, Genesis Waves and Torment of Hailfire, and trust that Witherbloom is going to let you cast them for such a huge X, so they're basically going to win you the game by themselves. So Witherbloom the Balancer, I actually think this has potential to be one of the scariest of the new Elder Dragons, just because affinity for creatures means you can get it on the battlefield for such a huge discount. So I think this card could see standard play. It can do just absolutely hugely explosive things, and if you build around this in Commander, it's one of those cards that you probably pretty much win the game the turn that you untap with this, assuming you have a decent amount of creatures on the battlefield. It is a wild card. Our next Elder Dragon might be the splashiest of the bunch, Prismari the Inspiration. So this is our Is It Elder Dragon, and it is a 7 mana 7/7 flying ward of 5 life, which not the best ward because you can always just kill it and take the 5, but its ability is wild. Instants and sorcery spells you cast have Storm. So Prismari the Inspiration, it's essentially 1,000-Year Storm for 1 more mana, but it's on a creature, and there's a small twist that 1,000-Year Storm only cares about other instants and sorceries you cast during the turn, when Prismari storms based on anything you cast before it during the turn. So if you play Prismari and then follow it up with the spell, your storm count will be 2 because of Prismari, so you get a little extra storm out of it. But as far as standard's concerned, well, first off, 1,000-Year Storm is more of an against the odds card anyway, so I think that Prismari isn't really designed to be a standard staple. We can probably build a ridiculous deck. Like, if we can actually get it on the battlefield and untap with it, we probably can win the game by giving everything Storm. Like, that should be very possible. But getting it on the battlefield and keeping it on the battlefield, even with the Ward of Pay 5 life, seems like it's kind of a challenge, because our opponent can always just kill it and take the 5, so I'm not sure this is designed to be a standard card. If it is going to work in standard, my guess is we need to take advantage of the one thing it has going for it compared to something like 1,000-Year Storm, which is, as a creature, it's much easier to cheat into play. So in theory, we can get it in the graveyard and zombify it, or Superior Spider-Man it for just 4 mana, and then have a bunch of mana to start casting spells and upping our storm count and storming off and winning the game. So that's kind of the hope, but really, I think this is designed to be a ridiculous commander card. And when I've played 1,000-Year Storm decks, I think the easiest way to build around them, like really, all you want to do is chain together a bunch of spells and you win the game. It almost doesn't matter what you're casting, but the spells that make treasures, like Seize the Spoils and Big Score and Unexpected Windfall, these are some of the best cards in a Prismari Storm style deck, because if you can cast a few spells and then Unexpected Windfall to discard a card, to draw 2 cards and make 2 treasures, and copy that like 3 or 4 or 5 times, they turn into rituals too, right? Where you're making 10 mana, 20 mana of treasures for a 4 mana spell, and you're drawing cards along the way, a huge amount of cards because you copy it a bunch of times. So that's the direction I would go. Plus, you know, Mana Geyser, rituals, any cheap cantrips card draw, just any sort of Storm style stuff is going to be ridiculous with this. And in Commander, there's a huge upside to this card, which is you get to play it in the command zone. And 1,000-Year Storm in the command zone is a absolutely ridiculous idea. So Prismari, I don't think it's really designed to be a standard card, although we will definitely against the odds it. But in Commander, I think this card is going to be one of the more popular Is It Spellslinger Storm style commanders. We also got our Simic Elder Dragon, and this one's really good. Quandrix the Proof. It's a 6 mana 6/6 flying trampler, so already very good flying trampling stats. And then it has Cascade. So when you cast it, you reveal cards from the top of your deck to hit a non-land with lesser mana value. You get to cast it for free. And then instants and sorceries you cast from your hand have Cascade. So Quandrix, I think this card could be standard playable. We've seen Trumpeting Carnosaur, say, play in standard, is a 6-drop with Discover 5, essentially the same thing as Cascade, sort of updated fixed Cascade. We've seen Anti-Casual Vestige see some play, which also kind of has a similar pseudo, not Cascade, but a 6-drop that puts a thing into play kind of ability with a big body. So I think that Quandrix, especially considering it's in Simic, which is a color that is really, really good at ramping into it, is going to be very powerful. Imagine just like Lesson from Lifing into Quandrix, and then casting another Lesson from Life, and cascading and putting more stuff into play. It is going to get out of hand super, super quick. The one thing I did want to mention about it is we've seen other cards that give things cascade, like the first sliver gives all your slivers cascade. The important difference with Quandrix is it only gives instants and sorceries you cast from your hands cascade. So you can't do the trick of first sliver where you like cast a first sliver and it cascades into a sliver, and that sliver cascades into another sliver, and that one cascades into another sliver. If you Quandrix and cascade and hit it instant, you're not going to be able to cascade off of that instant because you didn't cast it from your hand. But that's a pretty small thing. It's still just giving all your instants and sorceries cascade. It's something we've just never seen before in Magic. So where do we play this card? Outside of just ramping into it, I saw recently someone playing this weird mixture of like a Mightform Harmonizer Landfall deck mixed with a Lesson stack. In Quandrix, it is another one of those cards that you're going to want to have a bunch of instants in your deck, but you're probably also going to want to have, or sorceries, but you're probably also going to want to have threats to cascade into. So I think it's going to be a balancing act. If you just cascade into more card draw, into more ramp spells, you're not really making that much progress. I mean, I love drawing cards, I'm not going to complain, but I think you want a mixture where putting some threats into play along with casting spells to trigger it. So in standard, it seems very easy to ramp into. You got Badger Cub, you got Shared Roots, you got Lessons from Life. So I think you just turbo into this and cast it and cascade into something big. And then every instant sorcery cast in the future is going to do the same thing. In Commander, I almost don't like this card. I almost think this card, it might be one of those boring Simic commanders that just does the Simic thing too well. So Simic commander decks are about two things, which is green ramp spells that tend to be sorceries to ramp into stuff and get a bunch of mana in play, and then blue, and also green now, card draw spells to refill your hand. And Quandrix just rewards you for doing what you were going to do anyway. Like, all of your Shared Roots and Rampant Growths and Open the Ways are going to ramp you into Quandrix, and then they're going to start cascading once you have a Quandrix. So it gives these ramp spells that get bad in the late game more value as the game goes along. The same is true of card draw spells. You want to be playing them in your Simic deck anyway. You ramp into them, you draw a bunch of cards to refill. If you have a Quandrix out, now you're going to be cascading for even more value as you're casting your card draw spells. So in some ways, even though it doesn't work the same way, Quandrix reminds me a little bit of like Asai or Tetyova, these commanders that are very, very popular and very, very powerful, but they reward you for doing what Simic wants to do anyway, which is just casting those rampant card draw spells, which sometimes makes them a little boring. But I think that Quandrix, the cascade part of it, is intriguing and it is different, and I do like this card, but I do think it's going to be like sort of a generic-y Simic style commander deck, because it just feels like you don't have to do much work to build around it, because all the ramp spells and card draw spells are going to trigger it anyway. But this card, I think it's got standard potential. We know Cascade is busted, its stats are really good, and its ability is strong. Finally, we have maybe the most intriguing of the Elder Dragons, and the cheapest of the Elder Dragons, Silverquill the Disputant. So this is a 4-mana 4/4 Elder Dragon. It's an Orzhov, or Silverquill. It is flying in Vigilance, so kind of a Sarah Angel, and it says each instant and sorcery spell you cast has casualty 1. So as you cast the spell, you can sack a creature with power 1 or greater. If you do, you get to copy that spell. So Silverquill, kind of like Orzhov and Hilo the Painter, if you've ever seen an Hilo commander deck, except honestly better in a lot of ways, because Hilo only works for the first instant sorcery each turn, and it has casualty 2 rather than casualty 1. Being casualty 1 rather than casualty 2 is actually a huge, huge deal, because it means things that make 1/1 tokens when you cast a spell are going to work with Silverquill when they won't work with Hilo. But if you like Hilo style shenanigans, Silverquill mostly does that, but better, but in a weirder color combination. So what do we do with this card in Standard? So in Standard, I think maybe the best home for this, as weird as it sounds, is some sort of Sephiroth-style sacrifice deck. So if you're playing like a Sephiroth-style sack deck, you already want to sack creatures. So the casualty ability is going to be an upside because it's going to trigger your Sephiroth or whatever. And then what I'm envisioning is you do the normal Sephiroth game plan, you get down a Silverquill, and then you cast your game-ending Raise the Past, right, to reanimate a whole bunch of stuff. Then you're going to sack and trigger all the Blood Artists a bunch of times. But with Silverquill, you don't need that big of a Raise the Past, because what you can do is cast the first Raise the Past, casualty something to put another copy on the stack before the second copy resolves. But after the first one resolves, sack your entire board to Umbrocollar Zealot to get a whole bunch of the Blood Artist triggers and Sephiroth triggers, and then the second Raise the Past to resolve and reanimate everything again. So it opens up some really cool shenanigans, and that doesn't even include just like, you can cast a removal spell and sacrifice the thing you want to sack anyway to get 2 removal spells instead of 1, or a card draw spell or whatever, a Village Rice to draw a bunch of cards. So I think in a sack style deck where casualtying away your creatures is an upside, Silverquill actually seems kinda busted. We also know that pests are returning. We saw this on a new uncommon, Lewin Exchange Student, that pest tokens are going to be a Golgari thing. Pests, since they gain you life when they die, tend to be really good sacrifice fodder, so maybe there's some sort of like Abzan pest Silverquill casualty style deck. You could also play this in some sort of control deck. Like, control has the best things to copy. Like, 2 Jeskai Revelations is busted. 2 Stock Ups is very, very good. The challenge with control is, what are you going to have to casualty? But I think Fountain Port might be the answer to that, where you can use Fountain Port to make 1/1 tokens, get down your Silverquill, and then it doesn't take many double Jeskai Revelations to close out the game. The other thing this card works really, really well with, which I kind of hinted at earlier, is things that make tokens when you cast spells. So if you have a Monastery Mentor, or in standard Kuja, or Sedgemoor Witch, works when you copy spells as well, so it double triggers with the casualty. Young Pyromancer, if you get these down, as you're casting your spells, you're making these 1/1 tokens, and then you can sack those 1/1 tokens to double up your spells to make even more creatures, and then you make even more spells and more creatures, and you just have this huge turn where you cast a bunch of spells and have endless bodies to sacrifice for casualty. Also very good with things that make tokens, like Spectral Procession, or Lingering Souls, or Gather the Townsfolk, that put 2 or 3 bodies into play. They give you bodies you can sack to the Silverquill, but you can also double them up to make even more bodies with the Silverquill. So this card, there's so many ways to build around it, and at 4 mana, it actually seems kind of realistic to get it on the battlefield. As far as Commander is concerned, I think you do a lot of the things we were talking about, where you're making the tokens and doubling the tokens. You're playing the Monastery Mentors to make more 1/1s for the casualtying, but then you just add in these big finishing spells like Torment of Hailfire, Exsanguinate, or these big token makers like White Sun Zenith, where you can sacrifice your random 1/1s to copy them and use those as finishers to close out the game. So Silverquill the Disputant, man, it's very tough, but I think there's an argument that this might be the best of the new Elder Dragons, at least for 60-card formats, and in some ways it's the most intriguing of them to build around. Like, I think that the Simic one, the Quandrix one, is really good, right? It's obviously busted in Commander, but it's a little bit boring to me. Even the Storm one, that's very strong. In the Command Zone, you got a 1,000-Year Storm that's obviously busted, but still, I know how to build around 1,000-Year Storm. Silverquill, though, Silverquill does something that's pretty unique, and it's got the brewing juices flowing, so I'm definitely excited to brew around this card in 60-card formats and in Commander too. We also got a couple of new Planeswalkers in the set, starting with a brand new Planeswalker character in Professor Dellian Fel. And this card is a very old school Planeswalker. Like, other than having 4 abilities, this looks exactly like a Planeswalker they would have made in like 2016, 2015, like the peak of the Gatewatch era. So Professor Dellian Fel, 4 mana Golgari, 5 loyalty Planeswalker, +2, you gain 3 life. Not super exciting, but it is a lot of loyalty. If you +2 right away, it goes up to 7 loyalty. 0, you draw a card and lose a life. -3, destroy target creature. -6, you get an emblem with whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life, which obviously is a narrow emblem where if you're not in a deck with life gain, it doesn't really do anything, but if you are in a deck that has life gain effects, it can be a very effective way to close out the game. So Professor Dellian Fel, it's basically, literally, Ob Nixilis reignited. Like, this is back to the cookie cutter Planeswalker era. Like, look at these abilities. Yeah, you get a +2, gain some life, but draw a card and lose a life. pretty much the same. -3 destroy a creature, pretty much the same. An emblem that will win you the game eventually, probably pretty much the same. So this reminds me so much of Ob-Nixilis. And Ob-Nixilis actually saw play back in its era, although the current era isn't as Planeswalker friendly, so I'm not really sure. It is notable that Dellian's a whole mana less, although it is in 2 colors in Ob-Nixilis, but I think that Professor Dellian, I want this card to be good. This seems like a very solid mid-range card to me, and I think it at least has uses in Standard. So its emblem, obviously, is a Sanguine Bond, and Sanguine Bond has lots of potential for combos. We've seen it combo off with Exquisite Blood time and time again. So in the right deck, it is a very devastating combo piece. So where do we actually play this card in Standard? We'll answer one, and I feel like this is going to come up a lot in spoiler season because Standard right now is kind of Badger Mole Cub decks versus Izzet decks for the most part. But you can ramp into this with Badger Mole Cub, start drawing cards, start blowing up creatures. Golgari isn't the most popular Badger Mole Cub colors, but I think in a Golgari Badger Mole Cub deck, and they do exist, I think worst case Professor Dellian Fel, great sideboard card, right, that you can bring in to generate card advantage against the control decks. If your opponent sweeps away your board or deals with all your Badger Mole Cubs, well, at least you got this card advantage engine to rebuild. It also could show up in straight up Golgari midrange, which is like a tier C deck. Like, it's pretty far down the rankings at the moment. But if we end up in a world where midrange is good again, I could see Professor Dellian Fel be very good there. You even get like lifelink from Elegy Acolyte to work with the life gain synergies. The other possibility is, we know from past Strixhaven, and from the little bit we've seen from Secrets of Strixhaven, is that Witherbloom, or Golgari, is about life gain. Their whatever mascot common is Pest Mascot, which is essentially an Ajani's Pride Mate for 1 more mana, but you get trample out of it. So this is a card that might be even better once we see the rest of what Golgari has to offer in this set, because if there's a bunch of crazy life gain synergies, then that +2 of gain 3 life, rather than being like, okay, that's pretty mediocre, might actually be pretty exciting. The emblem that you get to in a single turn of plussing and get to keep the Professor around will be much more exciting if there's this crazy Witherbloom life gain deck that we get out of Strixhaven itself. The emblem, as I mentioned before, it is a combo piece. It's actually the same thing that Enduring Tenacity does, and also Southwind Avatar does. But if you have Bloodthirsty Conqueror, whenever your opponent loses life, you gain that much life, and you have Professor Dellian Fel's emblem, where whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life, and then anyone loses life or gains life, you start an infinite loop where Professor Dellian Fel triggers Bloodthirsty Conqueror, which triggers Professor Dellian Fel, which triggers Bloodthirsty Conqueror, until your opponent dies. This isn't something new, because we could already do this in Standard with Enduring Tenacity and Southwind Avatar, but Professor Dellian Fel gives us card draw to draw into the combo, so it might be worth reevaluating this combo for Standard once we get the rest of Secrets of Strixhaven. I think the floor for this card in Standard is basically Ral Crackling Wit. If you see how Ral Crackling Wit sees play, it sees play in a very popular archetype, right? Izzet. But it's not a main deck card for the most part. It's typically like a 2 of in the sideboard, and if you run into the grindy matchups, the control decks, and you need a source of card advantage, you need a repeatable value engine, then you bring in Ral Crackling Wit. I think the floor of Professor Dellian Fel is very similar to that, where you play this in the sideboard of like a Golgari midrange deck, or a Golgari Badger Mole Cub deck, or some 4-color Badger Mole Pyro or whatever, and you bring it in those grindy matchups. It's just a way you can keep drawing cards and killing things. So I think that's the floor for Professor Dellian Fel. And like I said before, if we get the right pieces in Secrets of Strixhaven, it could even be a very good main deck card. Our second Planeswalker is Return of Ral, is Ral Zerek Guest Lecture, and this card is weird. Not like how it plays is weird, but we have a mono black Ral Zerek, and there's also, if you notice, if you look closely at the pack version, the base version of Ral Zerek, there's this weird watermark on the card. Here is my little theory. So we know we're going to Reality Fracture. We know it's going to be innovative and weird. We've seen these hints about some sort of like alternate reality happening, some sort of color shift thing happening. I think that watermark is going to be the watermark of some sort of alternate reality that we're entering into with Reality Fracture, where we are going to see a bunch of very iconic characters show up in colors we are not used to, like Mono Black Ral Zerek. So essentially, I think this card is a plant for the future that's showing us where we're heading with Reality Fracture, and I am really excited for it because I love Planar Chaos, one of my all-time favorite sets. And if this is a less color pride breaky version of Planar Chaos that we're getting in Reality Fracture, this set is going to be absolutely awesome. So Ral Zerek itself, Unfortunately, the card kind of sucks. It's a 3-mana 3 loyalty planeswalker, +1 surveil 2, -1, any number of target players each discard a card, -2, return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, -7, flip 5 coins, target opponent skips their next X turns, where X is the number of coins that came up head. So, as I mentioned before, the jarring part about this is it's a mono black Ral, and every other Ral has been in Izzet, so it's a pretty huge shift color-wise, although I will say it's pretty cute that the ultimate of the new black Ral is essentially an inverted black version of the original Ral's ultimate, where the original Ral, for -7, you flip 5 coins and you take an extra turn for each one that comes up heads. The new one essentially does the same thing in a 1v1 game, where if you make your opponent skip that number of turns, that's really the same as you taking those extra turns. So very sweet callback to the original Ral Zerek. But as far as Ral Zerek guest lecture, here's my problem with the card, and I hope the card is good, but I don't think we live in the era where just being a 3-mana planeswalker makes the card good anymore. That might have been true 10, 15 years ago, but I don't think it's true in 2026. So if we look at these abilities, +1 you surveil 2, fine little value-y mechanic, but, you know, not game-breaking or anything. The -1, it's, I don't know, kind of like Liliana the Veil's discard, except you can choose not to discard yourself. So it can be kind of like a Davriel discard that is not as capped as Davriel, but maybe you want to discard because the -2 is essentially an Earth, which is probably the most powerful mode on Ral Zarek. And then the ultimate, as we talked about before, is essentially Ral Zarek's ultimate from the original Ral Zarek. So why do I think this card might be not that great? And the answer is, it doesn't protect itself at all. Traditionally, strong planeswalkers protect themselves. They kill something, they put a body on the battlefield to block with, and I just don't see that in Ral Zarek. Like, Surveil doesn't protect it. Making your opponent discard is nice, but it doesn't protect it. I guess the -2, in the right scenario where you have like something good to reanimate, could protect it by getting you a blocker, but then it also goes down to 1 loyalty, so it still dies to a couple like Earthbend lands or something, even through the blocker. So I just don't see this card protecting itself, which makes me a little skeptical that it's actually going to be that good. Like, planeswalkers that don't protect themselves have a pretty high bar to get over, and planeswalkers in general have a pretty high bar to get over in our super fast 2026 standard. So I think being able to reanimate like an Abhorrent Oculus, like Helping Hands, maybe that's the direction. Maybe this is like a value piece and you're not planning on this sitting out and generating long-term value, but you're planning on like playing it 1 turn, discarding an Abhorrent Oculus, reanimating it the next turn, and Ral Zarek did its job. Like, maybe that's what you do, is you don't think about this as a long game planeswalker, but almost like a short burst, generate value right away type planeswalker. So maybe there's a shell like that could make it work. I could also see trying it in a discard deck. We still have Bandit's Talent in Standard, which is kind of our rack style reward for making your opponent discard all their cards. The -1 does work pretty well there. You can play this and just tick down 3 times in a row to make your opponent discard 3 cards, maybe throw in a Surveil in between and you can tick down an additional time, so maybe it could work in a discard style deck. But Ral Zarek guest lecture, I think the big takeaway from this card is the watermark, the color shift, all that stuff. I think this card means a lot for where we're heading in future Magic sets, and I'm really excited for it. But as far as the card itself, I actually think this one might be a flop, but I don't know. Let me know if you're wrong. I've seen people excited about this card, so if you think I'm wrong, let me know in the comments. But I just can't get past the fact that it seems so bad at protecting itself that I feel like you just play this and it's just gonna die within a turn or two pretty much every time, and I don't know if that's worth it for 3 mana these days. We also got a new Black Wrath at Mythic, and this one's pretty straightforward in Withering Curse. So Withering Curse, it's a 3-mana sorcery. It says all creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn, but it has a new mechanic, Infusion, and Infusion means I do something even more busted if you gain life this turn. So if you gain life this turn, instead of giving all creatures -2/-2, you destroy all creatures instead. So Withering Curse, it's essentially like a malicious eclipse that upgrades into a painless toxic deluge if you gain life during the turn. And I think this card is very, very, very good. So first in Standard, just a -2/-2 mode is very good against a lot of the best deck. It gets most of the Badger Mold Cup deck. It gets all the threats out of the Prowess decks. They're just making all these 1/1s and all these slick shot show-offs. And these are the most played decks in the format right now. So I think the fact that the -2/-2 mode is going to be good a decent amount of the time if you can't gain life during the turn is really what puts this card over the top. I think for sure this card sees sideboard play. And if you can reasonably gain life, like maybe you play a Jungle Hollow and gain a little life, and you can turn this into a real Wrath, then this is insane. Like, current standard is so fast, I actually think a 3-mana Wrath is probably what we need, and this is a 3-mana Wrath with some hoops to jump through. You gotta gain the life to make it work, but I think it's gonna be worth it. Plus, remember, as we were talking about before, Witherbloom, all about gaining life, pest tokens, the new Planeswalkers, Professor Dellian Fel. We do have a lot of ways to gain life, so I think this card is built to be very good in a Golgari style deck, but I think it's even better than that because even if you can't gain life consistently, it's still going to be good enough in most matchups. As far as Commander is concerned, this card is very, very straightforward. In Commander, giving all creatures -2/-2 is not very good. It actually is just not impactful enough to put in a Commander deck. However, if you were a life gain deck, a 3-mana Wrath that doesn't cost you life like Toxic Deluge is absolutely bonkers. So I think this is a staple for any sort of life gain deck. Unplayable for decks that are not gaining life. But if you're playing Dina or like Frodo or Oloro, just sitting in the command zone getting you life each turn, or Zorline, or like Carrick decks need to gain a bunch of life to make up for all their Carrick life lost. If you're playing something that gains life, I think this is one of the best Wraths. I think it is literally alongside Toxic Deluge as tied for the best Wrath in Commander. Maybe Toxic Deluge is still a little bit ahead, even though you lose life, you get rid of indestructible things, but it is in that tier, like the best Wrath in your black deck and Commander tier. But to even want to play it, you gotta have life gain synergies in your deck. So Withering Curse kind of makes me a little salty to see a Malicious Eclipse style card, or even a Toxic Deluge style card, show up as a mythic, but the card is undoubtedly very, very powerful, and it should see a lot of play in Standard and in Life Gain Commander decks. Our last mythic for the day is one of my favorites, Improvisation Capstone. So this is a 7-mana Lesson Sorcery. It says exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a total mana value of 4 or greater. You can cast any number of spells from among them without paying their mana cost. So that part, yeah, okay, it's fine. Like, you cast it for 7, you get at least 4 mana value worth of spells. If you get lucky and hit like 1-drop, 1-drop, 10-drop, then you'd have like 12 mana value worth of spells. So you could get your mana value worth out of it, but by itself, that's not that exciting. The exciting part about this card is the new mechanic Paradigm. So Paradigm says, then exile this spell. After you first resolve a spell with this name, you may cast a copy of it from exile without paying its mana cost at the beginning of each of your first main phases. So essentially what that clunky line of text is saying is the first one of these you resolve, it goes to exile, and you get to cast it again for free at the beginning of each of your first main phases, which means this is essentially the return of Epic. If you don't remember Epic, there were 5 cards in Saviors of Kamigawa. They had the Epic mechanic, and Epic was you cast this spell, you get to copy it at the beginning of your turn for the rest of the game, but you can't cast other spells for the rest of the game. And in Mark Rosewasser's teaser for this set, he mentioned that an old mechanic was returning, but without the drawback, and it's gotta be this. Paradigm is quite literally Epic without the downside of not being able to cast other spells. So as far as Capstone itself, there's not a perfect comparison for this card. It's kind of like a Dream Harvest, but it hits yourself instead of each of your opponents. A little bit like Ignite the Future, which if you flash it back, you get to Impulse Draw and cast 3 of those things for free. Essentially, it's free value each turn. It just seems like, man, so fun to have this card hanging out in exile. So every turn you know you're going to get that free value of drawing extra cards. You don't have to worry. Like, even if your opponent counters it, it's just going to happen again next turn anyway. So what do you really care? It just seems like such a great thing to have Paradigmed. As far as Standard's concerned, I don't think this is designed to really be like a super strong standard card, but it does work really well with Iroh Grand Lotus. Iroh lets you flashback lessons from your graveyard during your turn for 1 mana instead of their mana cost. The problem with Iroh is we just haven't had big lessons like this in Standard. We have good lessons, but the lessons are very cheap and efficient. Firebending lessons, accumulate knowledges, things like that. But now thanks to Improvisation Capstone, and presumably the rest of this cycle, we're going to have some really big expensive lessons, which might make building around Iroh Grand Lotus a little bit more appealing. The other place I thought about playing this card is, it seems cute in Random Encounter as like a backup Random Encounter, where you're just like, can Random Encounter to put big things into play? Or if you don't have Random Encounter, you Improvisation Capstone, maybe you hit the Random Encounter and put a big thing into play. Worst case, maybe you hit a Golta or a Trumpeting Carnosaur or a Velgavoth and you put that into play. Worst Worst case, you somehow whiff, which should be hard because random encounter plays a lot of really expensive things, so there's not a lot of whiffs in the deck. But the absolute worst case, if you somehow whiff, you get to do it again your next turn for free and you get another shot at it. So I'm definitely going to try to build some sort of random encounter style of deck once we get Improvisation Capstone. In Commander, I think there's a few possibilities for this card. So first I should say, in Commander, I could see playing this in basically any red deck that can make a bunch of mana because it just seems super fun. But it's going to be especially good in decks that care about casting from exile, like Prosper. So you're constantly casting from exile, you're going to be getting your Prosper treasures. Or like the War Doctor also cares about things being put into exile. We already talked about Iroh Grand Lotus, seems really good in Commander too. But I would consider playing this in like Ashling Flame Dancer, Neeb the Eternal, any red deck that can just ramp into this. I think the value is going to be good enough most of the time. And then it gets even crazier if you're some sort of Spellslinger Magecraft deck like Viren that can take advantage of copying spells. So Improvisation Capstone, the card itself, I think is like reasonable. I'm excited to play it. I think it's very exciting, but I'm mostly excited for the Paradigm mechanic because I think Epic is such a cool mechanic. We haven't had anything like it in 20 years, and I think it's just going to be really, really cool to see what the rest of this cycle looks like, and they seem very fun to build around. Moving into the realm of rares, we get another new mechanic in Increment on Pensive Professor. So Pensive Professor, a 3-mana 0/2 with Increment. Increment means whenever you cast a spell, if the amount of mana you spend is greater than this creature's power or toughness, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. And then whenever one or more +1/+1 counters are put on this creature, you draw a card. So Pensive Professor, this card is very similar to Fathom Mage. Its ability is kind of exactly the same, except it's one or more counters rather than a counter. So you're not going to draw quite as many cards, but the comparison's actually perfect because Increment, it's literally the Evolve mechanic, the same thing, but for spells rather than creatures entering the battlefield. So Evolve was, when a creature enters, if it had greater power and toughness than the Evolve creature, you put a counter on it, like Fathom Mage. Pensive Professors, when you cast a spell, worth noting, it is just a spell. It doesn't say instant or sorcery spell. So any spell, creatures, artifacts, enchantments, are going to trigger this thing to get the counter, to grow it, and draw a card. So essentially with Pensive Professor, it starts as a 0/2, so if you cast a 1-mana spell, or spend 1 mana on a spell, you're going to get a counter and draw a card, but then it'll be a 1/3, so you need to spend at least 2 mana on a spell, and then you'll do it again, and you'll do it again, and keep working up the chain. So very similar to Evolve, very similar to the Fathom Mage. As far as actually playing this card, it seems insane with Mutagen Man. The first thing I thought, we played a Mutagen Man combo deck a few weeks ago, and I'm kind of addicted to Mutagen Man. Making your artifact tokens crack for 1 less and making a bunch of mutagen is wild, but Mutagen Man with Pensive Professor is kind of a combo. Mutagen Man makes a bunch of mutagen, you can crack them for free. Every time you put a +1/+1 counter on Pensive Professor, you draw a card, so you crack all those mutagen one by one on the Pensive Professor, and just draw like 5 or 10 cards, or something ridiculous, just for playing a Mutagen Man. So definitely going to be exploring the synergy between this and Mutagen Man, but the biggest upside of this card is it draws you cards whenever you put the counter on it. So it doesn't have to be from the Increment ability, which means Innkeeper's Talent or any other +1/+1 counter synergies work with this card. It's also in Commander, 2-card combo with Layla, Hieroglyphic Assistant. Layla says, whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on a creature. So you draw a card, you put a counter on the Pensive Professor, which then will draw you a card, which will trigger Layla to put a counter on Professor, back and forth, back and forth. You draw your deck, or as much of your deck as you want, then you just put the counter on something else. So you draw through all your deck, make a super big Pensive Professor, probably use it to win the game. So in Commander, I feel like this is probably a staple in the Layla deck. So Pensive Professor, I think this card's very cool. I'm excited to build around it. It is a 3-mana 0/2 at base, so I'm not super excited about it in Standard. To me, it feels more like a combo piece for specific decks and an ultra stable that every deck's gonna play. But in the right deck that's built around it, like with Mutagen Man or other counter synergies, I think Pensive Professor can kind of pop off. We also got another Increment card in Berta Wise Explorator. And this card, I can't help but think this is a ridiculous combo piece that could end up being incredibly busted, but we will see. It's a 4-mana Simic 1/4 Frog Druid. It has Increment, so the same ability when you cast a spell, if the amount of mana you spent was greater than the creature's power toughness, put a +1/+1 counter on it, then its ability, it's kind of the opposite of Pensive Professor. Rather than drawing a card whenever a counter's put on it, whenever one or more counters are added to it, you make 1 mana of any color. And then you actually pay X and tap it to make a 0/0 green fractal and put X +1/+1 counters on it. Not super important. So whenever I see an ability that makes mana for doing something for free and is uncapped, the first thing I think is, this has potential to be a combo piece, and this has potential to be broken. And I haven't figured out exactly how to Blake Berta yet. I'm sure there is a way to do it, though. I think it's very likely that there's a way to do it, because making mana for free is, historically, through Magic's history, literally the most broken thing you can do in the entire game. Free mana is the strongest thing that exists in Magic, and Berta, in its own weird +1/+1 counter intramidi way, does make free mana. So I've seen people compare it to Vivi. I wouldn't go that far. It's more mana. I think there's more hoops to jump through, but I can see the comparison where this just sits out and grows and grows and grows and makes mana and makes mana and makes mana. And Vivi was so strong that even like being 70% of Vivi is still a ridiculous Magic card. So what do we do with Berta? First thought, also very good with Mutagen Man. This actually turns Mutagen Man into a ritual, because you can crack your Mutagen tokens for free, but then Berta, if you put the counters on Berta, makes a mana when the counter goes on. So essentially, every mutagen that you sacrifice with Mutagen Man and Berta on the battlefield generates a mana, which has to be a combo potential right there. Like, just that, especially if you throw the ooze into the mix, so then you can, like, sack a creature to make even more mutagens, and then you can cast for free to make even more mana. There's got to be some sort of mutagen token combo deck involving Berta and Mutagen Man. So that's going to be one of the first brews I work on in Standard. Once you get back to other formats, like in Commander, this is a legend. There's stuff like Inexorable Tide. Whenever you cast a spell, you proliferate. So whenever you cast a spell, you add another counter to Berta, you get a mana for free. So it's kind of like a static 1 mana discount on your spells almost, but it gets even better because you also have Flux Channeler. You have Ichor-Moon Gauntlet, these other effects that add counters as you cast spells. So if you can stack enough of these up, every spell that you cast like a 1 mana spell, and you end up getting back like 3 mana with Berta or something. So everything turns into a ritual, and you chain together card draw spells and go through your deck and win the game. As far as actual combos, there's a few that I've seen floating around. None of them have really struck me as, this is the one. I think these are like the day one combos, but give it time and I think this card could end up broken. But like 3 Tree Scribe says, whenever another creature you control leaves the battlefield without dying, you put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, and then Shrieking Drake, 1 mana 1/1, when it enters, return a creature, including itself, back to its owner's hand. One of the creatures you control back to its owner's hand. So essentially, if you have 3 Tree Scribe, you got Berta, you got Shrieking Drake, you play the Shrieking Drake that triggers 3 Tree Scribe when it bounces back to your hand to put a counter on the Berta to make a mana, which lets you use that mana to cast the Shrieking Drake again and bounce it back to your hand to trigger 3 Tree Scribe. So essentially that gives you infinite enters triggers and an infinitely big Berta. Also, Intruder Alarm actually combos with the last ability. If you have like Blade of the Blood Chief, so when a creature dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on a equipped creature, you can like tap the Berta for 0 to make a 0/0 fractal, which will immediately die, but it'll trigger the Intruder Alarm to untap the Berta, and then the Blade of the Blood Chief will put a counter on the Berta, so you make a mana, then you do it again. So essentially infinite mana combo. I know, Intruder Alarm combos with everything, so not super exciting, but still another thing you can do in your Berta commander deck. So Berta, the card's got potential to be busted. Like I said, I haven't figured it out yet. It just got spoiled. I gotta do some brewing on this one. But I think that the ceiling on this card is straight up busted. The floor on the card is, it doesn't really see any play outside of Commander. So that is also a possibility too. But whenever you see uncapped mana production, you gotta take notice, because that card has potential to do some crazy things. Speaking of uncapped mana production, we got another one with another new mechanic in Opus in Molten-Core Maestro. So this is a 2 mana 2/2 Goblin Bard. It has Menace, and then it has Opus. So Opus is another new mechanic. It means whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you do something. In this case, you put a +1/+1 counter on the creature. But if 5 or more mana was spent on that spell, you also add an amount of red mana equal to this creature's power. Once again, uncapped mana production. You do gotta jump through the hoop of spending lots of manas on spells, right? You need a lot of mana being spent on instants or sorceries. But once this gets going, you can be generating mana as you cast spells, which is really, really wild. So this card is kind of a weird split card. On one hand, we've seen like Dragon Guard's Elite, Electrostatic Infantry, 2 drops that whenever you cast a spell, they get a +1/+1 counter. These cards were fine. I don't remember them being staples in their standard formats, but a 2-drop that grows as you cast spells, you could see trying it in like the Is It Prowess deck, Is It Spellslinger deck, something like that. I think you could just play this as a fair card and grow as you go. It reminds me, though, of Runaway Steamkin the most. Is the red 2-drop that has this combo potential to make a ton of mana. Runaway Steamkin, when you cast a red spell, it got a counter, and then you could remove 3 counters to make 3 mana. And this was played kind of like a fair card, like we were talking about. There were just fair decks that played it like a mono red deck, but it was also like this weird, almost Storm-style combo piece. And I think Molten-Core Maestro is very, very similar. So first, as I said, I could see trying this in just like the prowess decks. I don't know if it's actually going to be good enough. Like, it doesn't have great evasion. Menace is something, but it's not great evasion. It doesn't have haste or anything. So we'll see if it's actually good enough there. But I think it's something you could play in the Is It spell decks. And those are the most played decks in the format. But what I really see doing with this card is using it like a combo piece. So picture this. You got Molten-Core Maestro, and then maybe you spend 1 mana to Wild Ride it. So you Wild Ride it, now it's going to be up to 6 power, thanks to Wild Ride and the counter it gives itself. Once you get up to 6 power, then maybe you cast, I don't know, let's say a Season of the Bold for 5 mana to impulse draw a ton of cards. When you cast the Season of the Bold, it costs 5 mana, so Molten-Core Maestro is going to be like, hey, make mana equal to my power. So Molten-Core Maestro is going to get a +1/+1 counter, and then it's going to make you 7 mana. So you spend 5 on Season of the Bold, but you make 7, so you actually net 2 mana. And then out of all those cards the impulse draw, I don't know, maybe you hit a Brass's Bounty, and you're like, all right, I think I'll play a Brass's Bounty. So you spend 7 mana to play a Brass's Bounty, but that's going to put another counter on the Molten-Core Maestro, and it's going to be like, I'm going to make you 8 mana this time. And then you get a bunch of treasure tokens, and then maybe you got a Raphael's Technique, chilling in exile from the Season of the Bold. So you cast that to wheel away your hand. You trigger the Molten-Core Maestro. Now it makes 8 mana, then 9 mana. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger. So I can envision a world where if you can stick this card, you can't just pop off and win the game. Like, I see like Storm-style combo potential with this card, and it doesn't even seem that hard to pull off. In Standard, there is straight up infinite combo. Sorceress's Schemes is a 4 mana sorcery, but you can flash it back for 5 mana, and it says return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard or from exile with flashback that you own to your hand and make a red mana. So if we flash this back, we're spending 5 mana on the spell. If we have 2 Sorceress Schemes, we can just keep looping them. We flash back 1 to get the other one from exile, then we flash back the other one to get that one from exile. So we get infinitely big Molten-Core Maestro. We make infinite mana with Molten-Core Maestro, and if we throw like a Gutter Snipe into the mix, we just kill our opponent by pinging them for 2 every time we cast a spell. So that's another way you can combo with this card. It also just goes super infinite with buyback spells. Searing Touch is 5 mana, well 1+4 for buyback, to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. So you can pay 5 mana, you Searing Touch, because Molten-Core Maestro does not care about the mana value of the spell. It cares about how much mana you spent on the spell. You can Searing Touch for 5 mana, ping your opponent for 1. Assuming your Molten-Core Maestro is big enough, it should make back the 5 mana, then you do it again. Now it's making 6 mana because it gets a counter, then you do it again, 7 mana, then you do it again. You make infinite mana, you deal infinite damage. Same with Flaming the Flames. You can also do like Reiterate loops. Reiterate with buyback is 6 mana and it copies an instant or sorcery spell. So you can like put a Lightning Bolt on the stack, which will trigger Molten-Core Maestro to get a counter because you cast an instant or sorcery spell. Then you can pay 6 mana to Reiterate, targeting the Lightning Bolt to copy it. That's going to trigger Molten-Core Maestro's second ability to make a bunch of mana and get a counter. And then you buy back the Reiterate, you copy the Lightning Bolt, you hit something with the Lightning Bolt, then you Reiterate again, you do it again, infinite mana, infinite counters, infinite damage. This card is absolutely wild. In Commander, it's probably going to be its best in Spellslinger decks, probably any Spellslinger deck, honestly, but the more big spells, or the more spells that you can dump a bunch of mana into, the better. So Molten-Core Maestro, the card seems absolutely busted. This seems like Runaway Steamkin for 2026. The much scarier, much more combo-y, potentially just win the game if you can untap with this in a decent amount of mana card. So this card, I think, might actually just be straight up broken. Like, I think there is a chance this one's broken. I think the one before it, too, with the +1/+1 counter mana also has potential. But Molten-Core Maestro just seems so easy to go infinite with. We also got a new Prismari 3-drop in Colorstorm Stallion. So it's a 3-mana 3/3 elemental horse with Ward 1 and haste. It has Opus, so when you cast an instant or sorcery spell, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. If 5 or more mana was spent to cast that spell, create a token that's a copy of this creature. So Colorstorm Stallion, it is a super cool ability. It's got a little ward, it's got a little haste, it grows as you cast spells like a pseudo prowess, and then if you can cast expensive stuff, you start making copies of it. It seems very fun. But I don't know if we live in a world where just being a 3-mana 3/3 with haste is good enough anymore. There was a time, like back in Shadowmoor, where Bogart Ram Gang, you're a 3-mana 3/3, even with ridiculous mana cost, you get in there and deal damage. I guess we've seen Screaming Nemesis be very good, but that had a very, very powerful ability. But I'm not sure just a 3-mana 3/3 haste, even with Ward 1, is enough to see play. So is Colorstorm Stallion a playable card? The answer is maybe. I think the best shot for this card to be good is the decks that would want it would be some sort of like, is it Spelemental deck or is it Prowess deck where you play this, you chip in for damage, and then hopefully make copies of it to deal more damage. The problem is decks like that usually play a bunch of cheap spells, which are not going to be 5 mana to make copies of Colorstorm Stallion, but maybe you can do it with like Harmonize effects, Flashback effects. Maybe that's the way you can play cheap spells in your deck, but then still cast expensive versions of them at sometimes to get copies of the Colorstorm Stallion. So I don't know, that could be a possibility. It is the right creature type for Is It Spelementals? I don't know if Is It Spelementals is interested in a random hasty 3-drop. It also does fit in the Is It Prowess style decks, although again, what are you cutting? Do you really need it? Doesn't fit in Is It Lessons. That's the one Is It deck that it doesn't really fit in, but it could be in the conversation for the other two. But my guess is we find that Colorstorm Stallion, as cool as it is just at 3 mana, not quite efficient enough for the speed of Standard in 2026. So I think maybe it's like just not quite good enough for those decks, but it is a super cool effect. We also got Exhibition Tidecaller, which I think might be kind of busted. It's a 3-mana 0/2 Djinn Wizard. It's got Opus. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, target player, so not even target opponent, target player mills 3 cards. Then if 5 or more mana was spent to cast the spell, that player mills 10 cards instead. So Exhibition Tidecaller, it's essentially a brain freeze that sits out on the battlefield. It's a brain freeze only for instants and sorceries, but every spell you cast is going to mill for 3. It's also very similar to like Hedron Crab and Ruin Crab, but rather than caring about lands entering, it cares about spells being cast, instants and sorcery spells. And you know what? Instants and sorcery spells, in a lot of ways, are better than lands in this scenario, because land drops you're restricted to once per turn, unless you're playing ramp spells or something, but you can cast as many spells as you want. So Exhibition Tidecaller, kind of like the Brain Freeze, in theory you can play this and just sling enough spells to storm off your Manamorphoses and your rituals and whatever, and just literally mill your opponent's entire deck on the spot. And you could potentially do this on like turn 1 or turn 2, I think, in older formats. Definitely risky, because if your opponent just kills the Exhibition Tidecaller, it kind of all comes crumbling down. But still, I think the combination of Brain Freeze and Hedron Crab that cares about spells has a lot of potential. So what do we do with this card? In Standard, I actually think it's its weakest format. I think you can play it with Kitsune Technique or Singularity Rupture. These are big enough that you get mill 10s out of them, and that is a big chunk of cards. Like, you don't gotta mill 10 too many times to mill your opponent's entire deck. So maybe there's some sort of mill deck. The problem in Standard is we don't have a lot of cheap mill spells. We have these expensive mill health for your deck cards, but we don't have a lot of like early game mill spells right now. So we're gonna have to wait and see if we get some more mill support in Standard. In older formats, I think this maybe could be good enough for mill. Like, is this just better than Hedron Crab? If you're playing like a modern mill, this might just be better, right? Because you're going to be playing Glimpse the Unthinkables and Tasha Sidious Laughters and chain together spells, and this is like a Hedron Crab that is probably triggering multiple times each turn. So this might just join the Hedron Crab package in Modern Mill. I think it's in the conversation for that at least. The other thing about this card that we haven't really touched on, so far we focused on milling your opponent out. The true power of this card, though, might be filling your own graveyard. Imagine some sort of Arc-like Phoenix style deck, where all you care about is getting as many cards into your graveyard as possible so you can turn on your Phoenix. You're already playing a bunch of spells to get back your Phoenix. This is just a great turbo way to stock your graveyard. You play this, turn 2, cast 2 cantrips, you mill 6 cards. Like, it fills your graveyard super quick. It also is ridiculous with Underworld Breach, like kind of a 2-card combo with Underworld Breach. Every instant or sorcery you cast mills 3 cards. Breach needs you to exile 3 cards to escape something from your graveyard. So as long as you're escaping an instant or sorcery, the Exhibition Tidecaller is going to keep giving you the cards you need to exile to fuel your Breach forever until you eventually mill your deck and find your Thassa's Oracle or whatever your finisher is to win the game. So very, very good in Breach style decks. Also, Past in Flames, Yagg-Will, any deck that just really cares about filling their graveyard and is playing a bunch of spells. So Exhibition Tidecaller, the card's kind of crazy. Like, I think this card is actually very, very good. I would not be surprised if it was modern playable, maybe even playable further back than that. There's some weird, almost pseudo combo potential with Underworld Breach. Plus, you can just play it as a fair mill deck too. We also got Concillator's Duelist, a double white, double black Orzhov Core Warlock. It's a 4/3. It says when it enters, you draw a card and each player loses 1 life. Then it has another new mechanic and repartee that says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell that targets a creature, exile up to 1 target creature, return that card to the battlefield under its control at the beginning of the next end step. And I gotta say, I love this card. This is such a cool mid-range value card. It might be stone unplayable because I'm not sure you can play mid-range value cards in 2026, but what you do with this card is you play this card, you draw a card, everybody loses a life, and if your opponent tries to kill it, you can just cast a removal spell and kill your opponent's thing and blink out the Concillator's Duelist, and then it's going to come back into play on the end step, and you draw another card, and everyone loses life. It's just this endless value engine. So Concillator's Duelist, it reminds me the most, in a weird way, of Ghost Council of Arzova. If you've been playing for a long time, Ghost Council of Arzova, when it enters, target opponent loses life, you gain a life, and then you can sack a creature to exile it and return it to play at the end of turn. So very, very similar. The way they work is kind of different, but you even get the double white, double black mana cost. So I feel like this is the 20 years in the future, updated for 2026 version of Ghost Council of Arzova. It's also kind of Displacer Kitten at home. It does the same thing as Displacer Kitten, although Displacer Kitten triggers whenever you cast any non-creature spell. This specifically needs an instant or sorcery that targets a creature, and then Displacer Kitten returns the thing right away, so you get the combo potential. Concillator's Duelist returns the end of turn, so no combo potential, but maybe better wrath protection. So sort of like Displacer Kitten at home mixed with Orzhov Ghost Council. So this card, as I mentioned before, it's just very good with and against removal. Like, with removal, you cast your Get Lost or your Bitter Triumph or whatever, and you can just blink something out. Also worth mentioning, you can target your opponent's stuff, so you can blink out blockers and then swing in for more damage. Or you can blink your own things to reuse their ETB triggers. Or you can wait till your opponent targets one of your things and blink it out to fizzle your opponent's removal spell. And then it's also right against removal, because you can just cast a instant or sorcery that targets a creature in response to one of the removal spells and blink out whatever was going to die. So it's just a really, really solid value engine. As far as standard's concerned, seems really good with Ketramos. Ketramos has spells that target creatures, because you get lots of removal spells, you might have some blink spells. When things go to exile during your turn, you get to draw a card, so as you blink things, you draw with Ketramos, and then you get to drain your opponent and draw even more cards with Concillator's Duelist. This is also a great Panharmonicon card, doubling up the triggers, and then blinking all your other things with ETB triggers. So if you're playing Alishorn Mother Machines, Panharmonicon, this card definitely has a home there as well. In Commander, I think this is mostly, I would say, a blink deck style card. The only problem with this card is Orzhov's kind of a weird blink color. There's lots of blue-based blink decks, but you can play it in Aminatu. In Orzhov, I guess the most popular blink decks are Ketramos or Servandam, but if you're playing a blink deck and playing things that target creatures, I think this card is a very, very easy inclusion. So I think Concillator's Duelist, I think the card is really good. If it was 7 years ago, 10 years ago, I think I'd be thinking of this as one of the better cards in the set, potentially. I still think it's good today. I just wonder if a card like this, it's like kind of slow, value-y, grindy mid-range engine, can those cards really see play in 2026 standard? I guess we're going to find out, because if this one doesn't see play, that's a pretty big vote against, because the card reads very powerfully. We also got Hardened Academic, which is another good one. This whole set seems very, very pushed to me. It's a 2-mana Boros 2/1 Bird Cleric with Flying and Haste. It says discard a card. This creature gains lifelink until end of turn. And then whenever one or more cards leave your graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So Hardened Academic, I mean, I know where this one's going. This card is great with Cool But Rude. It's great with Monument to Endurance. This is another card that lets you discard your entire hand. You can do it during your opponent's turn, you can do it during your turn, and unlike some of the other versions of this effect, you don't even have to tap it down. So I think some sort of Cool But Rude or Monument to Endurance shell, this card seems absolutely bonkers. It chips in for damage, it gains lifelink to buff your life total, and it really is 2 mana, discard my entire hand if I want it to be. It does the same trick that like Flail does in the Rakdos Cool But Rude decks, but on a flying, potentially lifelinking hasty creature with additional upsides. It's also very cute with its second mode of putting counters on things as things leave the graveyard. It's a nice callback to Quintorius and original Strixhaven, and that could have some uses in Standard too. Like, if you think about some of the Cool But Rude decks, you got cards like Bloodghast that come back from the graveyard for free. You got stuff like Flame Lake Phoenix that come back from the graveyard for a single mana. So imagine, like, you do the Cool But Rude thing, you discard your entire hand, you got a bunch of Blood Artists, you make your land drop, they all come back into play for free, and then since all the Blood Artists come into play one by one, you're going to be able to get a +1/+1 counter on a creature for each Blood Artist that enters, and then maybe you sack Outlet and do it again, and next thing you know, your Hardened Academic is like this 8-powered lifelinker that's just gaining you a huge amount of life. So Hardened Academic, it's a synergy piece, right? I don't think you just play this in any random deck, but in those Cool But Rude style decks, or in decks with synergies for cards leaving the graveyard, I think this could be a straight up staple in those archetypes. We also got another iconic spell on a creature, Enjoined Researchers in Secret Rendezvous. So Join Researchers, a 2-mana 2/2 human cleric wizard. It is first strike. It says at the beginning of each end step, if an opponent has more cards in hand than you, this creature becomes prepared, and then you can cast a Secret Rendezvous, a 3-mana sorcery that says you and target opponent each draw 3 cards, as long as it's prepared. So Join Researchers, there is kind of a cool callback to the original art on Secret Rendezvous, which is nice, but Secret Rendezvous in 1v1 formats, you can't let your opponent draw 3 cards. So this is a non-starter for 1v1 formats. In Commander, though, I think this card might actually be kind of great, because in Commander, I think Secret Rendezvous is some of the best white card draw, and even though this does not enter prepared, so this is one of the downsides of the card, you can't Joint Researchers and immediately cast Secret Rendezvous. You have to cast Joint Researchers, and then wait until an end step with an opponent having more cards than you to prepare it, and then you can cast Secret Rendezvous. But that shouldn't be that hard to achieve, so it's a slow Secret Rendezvous, but it's a repeatable Secret Rendezvous, because it should be pretty easy once you get going for this to prepare every time around the table, so you can potentially just be Secret Rendezvousing and handing out these cards to yourself and one of your opponents every single turn. So Joint Researchers, horrible standard card. Please don't even consider playing it in standard. It is not worth it. You will die a brutal, horrible death. But in Commander, I think this card's in the conversation at least. We also got, oh man, I am not sure how good this card is, Grave Researcher, a 3-mana 3/3 Troll Warlock. It said at the beginning of your upkeep, you surveil 1. Then if there are 3 or more creature cards in your graveyard, it becomes prepared. And then its spell mode is Reanimate. 1-mana sorcery, put a creature card from any graveyard on the battlefield under your control. You lose life equal to its mana value. So when I first saw this card, I thought that it entered prepared, and it was essentially 4 mana. You get a 3/3 that surveils 1, and you can reanimate right away, and I thought this was one of the best cards from the set. But then I read it again, and I realized this is another one of the prepared cards where you have to wait a turn to prepare it. You have to play this, you gotta wait to your upkeep, you gotta have 3 creatures in your graveyard, and then it becomes prepared, and then you can reanimate. Once you get to that game state, you should be able to cast Reanimate every turn this sticks on the battlefield, as long as no one kills a Grave Researcher or exiles your graveyard, but you should be able to reanimate every single turn, well, until you run out of life from casting all the reanimates. But I think that this card, I'm really on the fence. I'm leaning towards it maybe not being good enough for standard, even though seeing Reanimate in standard is very, very shocking, because it is the best reanimation spell that has ever been printed. But when you actually think about it, it's kind of like a Valgavoss Faithful. It's a lot of mana. It's going to be pretty slow to get going. So I'm not sure this is actually better in standard, where it's going to be hard to stick this on the battlefield, than just casting like Superior Spider-Man or Zombify or something like that. Where I do think this card will shine is in Commander, the card is great. The other issue you have in 60 card formats is you only start with 20 life, and reanimate does take a lot of life, especially if you start reanimating big things. Your life total goes down very quickly. So with 20 life, it's not really realistic to cast reanimate too many turns in a row anyway. In Commander, though, the format's slower, the games are going to go longer, and you start at 40 life. So once you get this going, being able to just reanimate every single turn is going to take over the game pretty quickly. So it kind of reminds me of Marin of Clan Neltoth, is just this repeatable reanimation engine once you get it on the battlefield. Obviously, if you're playing the spikiest, most efficient, like, I'm going to try to Entomb Reanimate on turn 1 style of Commander Reanimator deck, then Grave Researcher are just going to be too slow. Like, if you're CDH reanimating, you're not really interested in this card. But if you're playing kind of, mid-power casual reanimator like Terra Herald of Hope, or maybe Madroltha the Gave Time, or Celis Rune Knight, then I think Grave Researcher definitely in the conversation. Is it going to replace Literal Reanimate? No, you still play Literal Reanimate too, but the ability to have this creature that fills your graveyard and theoretically lets you reanimate multiple times seems like exactly what kind of a mid-power casual reanimation deck wants. So, Grave Researcher, I hope this card is good enough for Standard. I kind of lean towards it being too slow for Standard, even though just seeing the word reanimate on there, I'm like, there's no way. This has got to be good enough, right? But I think now that I've read the whole card, I think it might actually be a little slow for Standard, but it does seem super fun in a Commander Reanimator deck at least. Of course, since we're going back to Strixhaven, the Mystical Archives are also back, and if you missed Mystical Archives the first time, they were easily the best part of original Strixhaven. They were really exciting reprints with super spectacular art, and then they also had these super rare Japanese versions. They had even more spectacular art. So we got our first look at some of them today. The big hitters here: Vampiric Tutor, obviously ridiculous. The Japanese version going to be super expensive. And then Force of Will. This one I'm super excited for because it's going to be the first time we've had Force of Will on Magic Arena. And whenever we get these reprint sets, I'm always looking not just for new cards to teach Arena Zoomers about, like Smallpox maybe might be a good Teach Arena Zoomer cards, but cards that are just relevant for formats like Timeless. And I think Force of Will, in a super degenerate format like Timeless, Force of Will is going to really have a massive impact on that format and make it start to look a little bit more like Legacy, which I think is a good thing. The other exciting part about these cards, Wizards did confirm in the stream, you will get one of them each and every pack, even in play boosters. So they also add really powerful spells to the limited format, which is super sweet as well. So Mystical Archives coming back every pack, and they look even better than last time. We also got one random card from Streakers of Strixhaven Commander in Eiganjo Dynastorain. So we get the full Commander decks, I believe, tomorrow. Tomer's going to be covering them on the Commander channel, but I want to mention this one briefly because the card is pretty sweet. It's a 3-mana 2/3 Fox Advisor. It has Vigilance. It says whenever you attack with 2 or more creatures, this creature becomes prepared, and then its spell side is Replenish, a sorcery. This is return all enchantment cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. So Replenish is a reserve list card that's hundreds of dollars at this point. So seeing this on a creature is actually very interesting for Commander in specific, because if you're an enchantment deck in Commander, having Replenish actually something you really want. It is one of the most important cards in your deck, but a lot of people are priced out of this card. And I think this might be the new best budget version of Replenish. It is a little awkward that you need to attack with 2 creatures to prepare it. The downside is you need 2 creatures on the battlefield. The upside is, as long as you have creatures on the battlefield, you can play this go to combat attack, immediately prepare it, and then post-combat main phase, Replenish to be able to reanimate all your stuff and probably win the game. But if you look at the bad Replenishes, if you think about Eiganjo Dynastorain, it is 7 total mana, right? 3 to get the creature on the battlefield, 4 more for the Replenish. But if you look at the competition, discounting Resurgent Belief, which you got suspend, it takes a lot of time. You have Open the Vaults, reanimates all artifacts and enchantments, but it does it for your opponent's 2 for 6 mana. Then you have Brilliant Restoration, returns all your artifacts and enchantments, but it's 7 mana, including 4 right. You got Redress Fate, 8 mana to do that. You got Triumphal Reckoning, throws Planeswalkers into the mix, but it's 9 mana. So when you consider the cost of reanimating all your enchantments, 7 total mana for Eiganjo Dynastorain might actually just be the best way to do it. Worst case, you probably want multiples of these effects in your Enchantress deck, so I think in Enchantment Commander decks, especially graveyard ones, or even just for protection for some sort of Wrath, I think this is probably going to be a pretty close to staple level card. We also learned that the Innistrad Slowlands, at least half of them for now, are coming back for Standard, and these lands actually pretty solid. Like, they saw a lot of play last time, they're good in Commander. The only downside you see of this land cycle is some of them are not especially valuable as far as opening packs, because Wizards has done a really good job of reprinting some of them in Commander precons. So some of them are like $1, but then the ones like Stormcarved Coast, they haven't got reprinted much, are like $10. So it's not going to be like a huge amount of value for opening boosters, but a very solid land cycle. Another round of reprinting should help make sure the price stays cheap for Commander players. Plus, these cards are very good in Standard decks as well. We also got just a ton of lore rarity cards, and this has already been a very long video, so we're not going to go in depth on all these, but there's a cycle of mascots showing off each of the schools. So Pest Mascot for Golgari, Inkling Mascot for Orzhov, Spirit Mascot for Boros, Fractal Mascot for Simic, Elemental Mascot for Izzet. Of these cards, I don't think any of them are like super push for constructed. They are commons after all, but Pest Mascot, kind of a 3-mana Johnny's Pridemate with Trample that could see some play in a life gain style deck. We also got a cycle of uncommon students, and most of these I think are going to be kind of draft chaff, although I think some of them could have potential. Luin Exchange Student, a 4-mana 3/4, it enters prepared, then you can exile a card from your graveyard to prepare it only as a sorcery, and then it has Pest Friend as its spell mode. So for 1 Golgari hybrid mana, you create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token that when it attacks, you gain 1 life. Interesting, they changed the pest tokens to gaining life when they attack rather than dying this time. But yes, you make a pest token. So I think that card in an Insidious Roots deck, it seems pretty good. It is just repeatable ways to exile cards from your graveyard. So in theory, if you had an Insidious Roots on the battlefield in like 10 creatures in your graveyard, you could just like prepare and then pay 1 mana to Pest Friend to make a token, then prepare to exile a card and trigger Insidious Roots. So it seems very, very good in Insidious Roots in specific. Abigail, that one's draft chaff. Kroll seems like draft chaff. Tam, probably draft chaff, although also very Simic-y, with Deep Sight spell being draw a card and gain 1 life, and all you need to do to prepare it is make a land drop, so very Simic landfall-y. And then Sinar actually intrigues me. It's a 2-mana 0/4. It enters prepared. Its spell is Wild Idea, 5-mana sorcery, where you search your library for an instant or sorcery, put it in your hand, so not super exciting, but its creature ability is tap to make a treasure token, activate it only if you've cast an instant or sorcery this turn. So in some sort of Spellslinger deck, this is actually a pretty consistent mana dork, where every single turn you can just tap to make a treasure, and making a treasure is even better than a lot of mana dorks because you can store it up and use it in multiples in 1 turn, or you can keep them on the battlefield even after Sinar dies. So I could see this being an interesting mana dork in some sort of Spellslinger deck. So I think Luin, interesting for Insidious Roots. Sinar, just kind of interesting in Spellslinger. Tam does Simic stuff. You can play it in like a landfall deck. The other two, probably just going to be for draft. Otherwise, we get a bunch of lower rarity cards that you mostly see play in Limited, although 2 worth mentioning: Biblioplex Tomekeeper, Sky Coach Waypoint. Wizards mentioned during their stream today that there are 2 cards in the set that can prepare creatures outside of the creatures and their own abilities, and it appears to be these 2 creatures. Biblioplex Tomekeeper, 4-mana 3/4, when it enters, you can prepare something. Probably not constructed playable. Sky Coach Waypoint, maybe a land that comes into play on tap, makes colorless, or you can pay 3 and tap it to make target creature become prepared. So obviously paying essentially 4 mana to prepare, I don't know, the Ancestral Recall thing, probably not going to be worth it. But if we see some really expensive, powerful prepare abilities on creatures that are difficult to prepare a second time, I don't know, maybe there could be a deck that could make use of it. Otherwise, it's mostly stuff that you'll see in Limited, and you can check out over on MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of day 1 of Secrets of Strixhaven spoilers, and I gotta say, I am blown away by this set. I am absolutely blown away. Our first visit to Strixhaven was kind of mid for me. I thought it was fine. It was like average, but it wasn't one of my favorite sets. This version though, oh my goodness, the iconic spells with the prepared stuff, all the callbacks seem absolutely wild. I think this version of Strixhaven looks way better than the first, and my hype level is kind of through the roof, but I want to know what you think. Now that we've seen a bunch of spoilers, what is your hype level? What do you think about Secrets of Strixhaven? Let me know in the comments, let me know what card you're most hyped about, and I'll be back tomorrow for even more Secrets of Strixhaven spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon.